Welcome to the 5th event of our Media Care Talk series, hosted by the Suraj Israni Center for Cinematic Arts at UCSD. I am Wentao, a third-year Ph.D. student in literature and the co-organizer of this talk series. To kick off our event today, I would like to acknowledge that UCSD is built on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Film Studies Program, Department of Communication, Department of Visual Arts, 21st Century China Center, Institute of Arts and Humanities, Program for the Study of Religion, and Department of Literature, as well as Tara Nadeau, Rihanna Swice, Anthony King, and Michael Trujillo for their tremendous help. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'd like to announce our next event. Professor Vishnupriya Ghosh from UC Santa Barbara will give the final talk of our series titled The Blood Files, The Politics of Epidemic Media via Zoom at 5 p.m. Thursday, May the 18th. I will share the link to registration later on in the chat. And additionally, the video recording of earlier talks given by Joshua Neves and Hannah Zivan is now available on the YouTube channel of UCSD Arts and Humanities. Please subscribe our channel so you can discover more about our talk series. And I will also share the link to our YouTube channel in the chat later on. And now it is my honor to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Ying Qian. Ying Qian is Associate Professor in Chinese Cinema and Media at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultural Studies at Columbia University. Her first book, Revolutionary Becomings, Documentary Media in 20th Century China, forthcoming this year by Columbia University Press, studies the making of documentary media, broadly defined to include newsreels, educational, industrial, and scientific films and media in 20th century China. She's now working on a new monograph on media and the ecologies of knowledge in social movements. Her articles have appeared in Critical Inquiry, New Left Review, China Perspectives, Oxford Handbook of Chinese Cinemas, New Literary History of Modern China, and other journals and volumes. She curates, makes video, and contributes to activist communities whenever she can. So welcome, Qian Laoshi, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. I really want to thank Wentao and also to Professor Daisuke Miao for inviting me to speak at this amazing series on media and care. I also want to thank Professor Géraldine Fiss for being my discussant. So I'll share my screen. Okay, I think it works. Yeah. Okay, so in the previous talks in the series, we have heard about many different kinds of media, from big data pharma, telephone hotlines for the distressed, to art installations to share sleep together. In this talk, I return to a more familiar media, documentary film. Of course, it's quite natural to think about documentary film in relation to care. Here, I think about care in a number of ways. First, feminism, feminist scholars have been talking about the ethics of care since the 1980s, positioning care as specific relational interactions, offering nourishment and support to mutual nourishment and support. At the same time, Bernard Stiegler also talks about care as to pay attention. Our experiences are bound and shaped by the attention formation in our societies. he says that we cannot have experiences without knowing what to pay attention to. And of course, documentary, as we know it, is a deeply relational media. Its process of production rely heavily on specific relationships built around and across the camera. In my documentary classes, I always tell students that documentary does not frame reality, but it frames relationships, because it's the camera that's in between these relationships that record the dynamics of these power relationships. At the same time, documentary as a media also guide us and our attention for learned political and ethical responses. So documentary has been deeply involved in progressive politics, and recently, as documentary in the 20th century moved into the new media environment, scholars have also theorized documentary as a connector or creative hub among vast fields of media activity, and also documentary digital participatory documentary as open space practices of co-creation, collaboration, and community, and thinking about filmmakers not just as filmmakers or auteurs, but as community designers, right? And documentary production became an ongoing process of community mobilization and renewal. But in this talk, I wanted to go to a historical period, to the early 20th century, when documentary was still being formulated and experimented, and indeed, documentary as a term had not been coined. And I wanted to show, and my book further shows that documentary from its earliest time had been very similar to what we theorize as new media documentary, had been a builder of networks and connections, and also as a way to direct our attention and think about what kind of forces shape our attention. I want to start by this 1925 documentary, and the problem of working on early cinema, of course, was that the film is no longer extant, and so you can just take a look at the still image while I speak. On May 30th, 1925, gunshots erupted on the busy Nanjing Street in Shanghai's international settlement. At the gate of the Laoza police station, the police force under British command fired into a crowd of 10,000 Chinese protesters, killing 12 and wounding 17. Upon hearing the news, filmmaker Chen Jianran of the United Film Company, that's Youlian, rushed to the scene by car with his colleagues. And from the car window, the group filmed police washing away the traces of blood on the ground and recorded damage from gunfire on the streets. Chased by policemen on horseback, the filmmakers sped away in their car, and by the time the police caught up, their new portable IMO camera, and that's 35mm camera, had been safely hidden in the actress's wide leg pants. They were told to go. So the footage shot in that day was edited into a 3-reel film entitled The May 30th Shanghai Movement, Wu Sa Hu Chao. The film was no longer extant, but we can still know about the film's making and exhibition from memoirs and contemporary published materials. Sympathetic doctors, for example, helped the filmmakers gain access to otherwise inaccessible hospitals in the international concession to film the injured workers and students getting treatment. While the Helen Road morgue in the international concession was off limits for filming, the Association of Workers, Merchants, and Students, 工农学联合会, helped locate 5 corpses of slain protesters at a charity organization in the Chinese part of the city, the Huajie. And filming there was supported by the charity staff, who even constructed a temporary skylight in the roof to ensure sufficient light. Upon its completion, the film ran for 7 days at the Republican Cinema, the Gonghe Daxiyuan in the Huajie, with all revenue donated to assist workers on strike. And by that time, the workers were going on a general strike in the city. The film was then exhibited widely at organizational meetings and fundraising activities brought by the activist networks to neighboring cities. So basically sneaked to the neighboring cities, such as Hangzhou and Suzhou, to facilitate labor organization in the first large-scale working-class militancy around the urban centers in east of China. So, when we think about documentary, and at this time documentary hadn't been coined, standard documentary of history, standard account of documentary attributes the term documentary to British filmmaker and critic John Gerson, who first used the term in 1926 and later defined it as the creative treatment of actuality. So Gerson's definition asserted the actuality, which is the documentary's photographic realism, the automatic and transparent action of filming, putting the camera down and filming what's in front of a camera. He suggests that actuality is not enough to define documentary, but documentary has to be a creative treatment. That is, it has to be the art of a cinema auteur. And of course, we know that this definition of documentary has now been provincialized. We understand this definition as Gerson's attempt to carve out a niche for documentary filmmaking in the international market, competing with Hollywood, and also to give a space for documentary filmmakers as film artists, because artists, of course, was a professional category that comes with support. But photographic realism for early Chinese documentary filmmakers, or filmmakers by then they were making films of different kinds that were called different things, was something different. There was an intense awareness of documentary realism as a political, infrastructural, and technological advantage that filmmakers often did not have. Access, for example, required support by activist networks, which became further expanded. These networks became expanded and strengthened through the film's exhibition. So from the very early period of Chinese documentary filmmaking, filmmaking was deeply embedded in community and in activist networks. And in 1925 was really, when we think about documentary access, one very interesting comparison was to compare the realities of Chinese filmmakers worked with and the American newsreel and the omnipotent American newsreel photographer or cameraman. 1925 was the heyday of American newsreels. Chinese filmmaker Cheng Bugao, writing at age 27 in 1925, marveled at the magical infrastructural efficiency of the American newsreel. For example, in this article written in 1925, he talked about the amazing feat that American companies managed to show the newsreel of the sinking of the Japanese ocean liner Reifuku Maru in the Atlantic 70 hours after the boat sinking in New York cinemas. Of course, newsreel production and distribution relied on extensive networks of correspondences with privileged access to filming locations, as well as the infrastructure to swiftly process and transport films to cinemas. And as the operation costs become even higher with the adoption of sound recording technology in 1927, only the biggest film companies that benefited from vertical integration would afford to make and market newsreels. And while imported American newsreels had long been a part of Chinese film culture. Often they were viewers' first encounters with actuality-based filmmaking. Chinese film companies in the 1920s and 30s had no capacity to sustain regular newsreel production of their own. One reason was that Shanghai filmmakers had limited accessibility to filming locations. Chen Jianran's documentary, for example, of the May 30th movement illustrated that difficulty. In addition, Shanghai film studios had difficulty expanding through vertical integration, and their efforts to vertically integrate was thwarted by war disruptions. For example, the United Lianhua had cinemas in Manchuria, but that was disrupted by Japanese occupation of that period. And within Shanghai, foreign capitals dominated distribution and exhibition, the cinema network. And so when we think about American newsreel, I draw from Joseph Clark's book on News Parade, the American newsreel and the world as spectacle, where he talks about the watershed moment of American newsreel was the Lindbergh ticker tape parade of 1927. This event, which happened in New York, celebrated the transatlantic flight by Lindbergh, which integrated the world in this one space where the newsreel also was able to penetrate and also to bring, so like the parade that happened on the street, Clark also argued that the newsreel films also provided the American audience with a parade of news and infotainment for an integrated world. Contrary to in the US, the Chinese watershed moment for news films was far from celebrative. Actually, it was a deadly Japanese air raid on the city of Shanghai on January 28, 1932, that brought news films to the forefront of film production and exhibition. So the Lindenberg Parade was a mass celebration of spatial integration, yet the air raid over colonial Shanghai laid open the dark secret of aviation development and tore urban space apart vertically and horizontally. Vertically, the Japanese domination of the airspace rendered the city defenseless, and horizontally, only the Chinese part of the Shanghai segmented urban space was targeted for distraction, with homes and businesses burning, and also severe damage to the Chinese film industry. A large portion of the early film was burned in that instant. So on the day after the air raid, Shenbao reported that 3 American film companies had applied for permits to film, and their cameras were already rolling on the day of the bombing. And over time, many newsreel films were made by American and British companies, and that began to exhibit already in February and March around the world. Newsreel films in the early 1930s had already been becoming a bit boring and uninteresting for film critics, yet Shanghai, the Battle of Shanghai heralded a new era of newsreel, where real reporting and real showmanship was about to dawn, as Ramsay wrote in the motion picture Herald. He also, in the same article, talked about the omnipresent American cameraman, which by then had already become the role model for teenage boys in America, and said that neutrality had given American filmmakers full access to Shanghai in war. 8 filmmakers moved freely in the foreign concessions and the Chinese part of the city. Only the Asian American newsreel one had some difficulties with access. But Chinese filmmaking happened at a much slower pace. As I said, American newsreels were already exhibited in March, February and March, but the Chinese productions only screened starting in May, largely because foreign concessions were inaccessible for production and exhibition. Neutrality meant no exhibition of anti-Japanese films, and also the film studios and cinemas in the Chinese part of the city were heavily damaged. So if the Battle of Shanghai reinvigorated American newsreel, Shanghai filmmakers at that time started to really think about the politics of on-location filming, which had everything to do with infrastructure, with access, and began to ask questions about documentary ethics and politics. As we can see in this advertisement spread for Hearst Metrotron newsreels, American newsreel man was here being placed as this neutral figure, and here on the right it says it happened in China, but you know more about it than the Chinese. And you know, in terms of film exhibition, that's certainly true. But of course, on the ground, the Chinese had deeply devastated experiences with the bombing, especially the Shanghai inhabitants. I'm going to skip over this, and maybe I can show a bit later, which is a British Potter documentary, a newsreel on this event, which had similar kind of a tone of neutrality, and also showed how Chinese were during the wartime being barred from entering the international concessions, which also you know, was the lot of the Chinese filmmakers. They were unable to move around. And because of this, Chinese filmmakers began to start to practice, to use docu-fiction as a way to mend the fragmentary nature of their footage, and also began to discuss what does it mean to make films for this devastated city, you know, for its inhabitants and not for remote spectators of this. And Cheng Bugao in that time made a news film, The Battle of Shanghai, which was a fiction. It situated the war mainly in the Chinese part of the city, instead of wandering all over the city, including the international concessions. It was a docu-fiction with Mingxing film stars, Mingxing studio film stars acting as a member of a family devastated by war and helping in rescue and medical work. The fiction part anchored actuality footage in emplaced and embodied experiences of the city, and the advertisement accompanying the film emphasized the film was made for the people in the city with no opportunistic motives. Unlike newsreels swiftly made and forgotten, this film was made to last as memento of the tragic event. And this film was very popular. It was screened from late July through late December, and attracting a large audience, and also had a lot of added screenings. So when we think about left-wing filmmaking in China in the 1930s, we tend to not to see documentary there. Indeed, as Lai Quanpan in her wonderful Building a New China in Cinema talk about the left-wing filmmaking movement, she asked, why is it that you know, documentary was not part of the picture? Small format camera by then was already used in the Soviet Union and in Japan, but there was hardly any voice heard in 1930s Chinese left-wing cinema circles advocating the use of documentaries, which were produced and watched in China since the 1900s. And Lai Quan called it a missed opportunity. And we also know, of course, about the hard and soft cinema debate of 1932 and 1935. And this had to do with left-wing filmmaking in Shanghai. The filmmakers' further left turn after Japan's bombing of Shanghai in 1932, and also the left-wing politics in the cities moved to the cultural front after the defeat in 1927 of the CCP-led union movement and workers' movement, which relegated the CCP and a lot of activists into the countryside. We also know that there is a modernist response. For example, Huang Jiamo, which is a leading proponent of the soft cinema camp, in his article talks about cinema as soft and as presenting life's richness and beauty, and Liu Na'ou talking about cinema as an aesthetic experience foremost. There's a lot of scholarship on this debate, but documentary was not part of this scholarship. And I wanted to, already point out that, we have already documentaries made within the activist community in 1925, even though it was not small gauge cinema yet, right? That was the beginning of small gauge cinema. It was 35 portable AMO, but also Cheng Bugao and the whole experience of the war in the air raid in 1932 prompted docu-fiction practice, which was very much part of the left-wing filmmaking. And I will also talk about Liu Na'ou's soft documentary filmmaking and thinking about them as two ways of care. Cheng Bugao wrote in 1933 about machine guns, airplanes, bombs, and basically about how how war had affected his thinking on film and his left turn. And his docu-fictions, Torrent and Spring Silkworm, Kuangliu and Chuntan, both of 1933, really worked with conventional documentary modes, the newsreel, as I discussed earlier, and industrial films, but brought with it subversion and reflexivity. The Torrent, for example, told a story of basically a flood that flooded the village, with the villagers struggling for their lives, while the landlord, Mr. Fu, was relocated to the city and viewing the devastation of the flood with binoculars from the safe afar. But what Chen did was that he used his own news footage from a 1931 flood. Actually, early Chinese filmmakers, they moved back and forth between documentary and film and feature film. And this documentary was commissioned by a charity organization. And through point of view editing, he showed that his news footage was what Mr. Fu saw in his binoculars. And therefore, fiction here reflexively framed news film as where images of distant suffering are pursued as spectacle. Spring Silkworm, that film is available. Torrent is no longer available, but Spring Silkworm is available and you can see it online. It's a beautiful, and I would argue a left-wing process film, because it shows, as you can see from the left to right, from top to bottom, it shows from the seeding of the silkworms, and then you put it next to your body, and then the silkworm gradually grew up, and then you also had to do a lot of rituals to ensure that they grow up, and in the end they make the cocoons and there is a harvest, and that was being sold. But of course, the final stage of the harvest being sold, then the price dropped because of the artificial silk, which is nylon, imported from Japan. And so the farmer's family, despite of the harvest, had a bankruptcy. So the silkworm, so American another place, I cannot go into details, but American industrial films had already been in China during the World War I, and process films, which basically streamlined and rationalized industrial processes for educational purposes, especially training workers, had been used to modernize Chinese silk farming techniques in order to export, in order for the American companies to receive raw material imports from China. So silkworm as a process film was in every way subversive to the capitalist or the American process film. There was no streamlining of production. Silk farming was treated as integral to family and community rituals and relationships. The filming followed strictly the silkworm's life cycle. The filmmaking was understood as a sketch, which meant life drawing from life. The filmmakers deliberately distanced it from melodrama and said so in their discussions, their public discussions, which was then published. And the tragic climax of the film was not melodramatic. There was no, love story that's being thwarted, but it was about the reversal of the process film's expectation of success, basically the bankruptcy despite the harvest. And so I will now turn, with the pick of time, I'll now turn to soft documentary in the soft cinema camp. Liu Na'ou, of course, as many of you know, he was a colonial subject from Taiwan, studied in Japan, and then came to Shanghai, and was mostly pictured as basically a playboy in the Shanghai cultural scene. He made documentaries, even though he hid it. We only got his documentary in the 1990s when the reels were discovered in the attic of his ancestral home. And his disavowal was a very interesting phenomenon, and I talked more about it in the longer paper. Amateur films were practiced a lot among the foreign settlers in Shanghai, and that's another topic that I touched upon in the longer paper, and it's worthwhile for more research. Home movies and travelogues were the most popular of this floating population, so we can really think about cinema and kind of the settlement and also diasporic experiences, building new relationships in the city with other diasporas. But Liu disavowed his filmmaking, hid it, largely because of two hierarchies. One is the hierarchy between amateur and professional filmmaking. I'm just looking at my time just to make sure. Yes. And filmmaking, because even in other parts of the world, amateur filmmaking and professional filmmaking were very separate when amateur filmmaking emerged and became, and developed. And so Liu, wanting to protect his professional persona, hid it, I believe. But more importantly, he wanted to try to obscure his own colonial Taiwan subjecthood, telling people that he's from Fujian. And so what was really interesting to look at his amateur filmmaking was to see men holding a movie camera. It was called 持摄影机的人, holding a movie camera as a handheld, makeshift and soft version of Diga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera. And a lot of you know Vertov's one, which is shot exclusively, almost exclusively on a tripod. And it also showed an omnipresent, omnipotent filmmaker mastering, the whole cityscape and taking risks by train, filming train and so on. But in Liu's filmmaking, there is no mastery nor revolution, but simply a desire to create a foothold and waterways for survival. For example, in his reel on his home, he depicted a beautiful home estate in South Taiwan where his family lived, but portraying it as a space of care and also a foothold for cultural survival. There is the if you look at the lower left and middle pictures, you see that Ye Hanqing, the painter, who is a very important Chinese painter in Taiwan's colonial periods, was painting in his home, and then putting up these Chinese paintings, which had to do with literati paintings of sort of showing the virtue of recluse, basically, on showing that on the wall. And so that the home then became this place where art continued to circulate and exhibited for cultural survival. He also depicts relationships and friendships he met in his travels. A big part of his documentary was about, it was travelogue, and there he depicted a lot of water and movement and instability, and it was in this this very unstable environment that he met his friends. He became attuned to relationships built on unstable grounds, and he celebrated friendships which served horizontal protective networks for colonial subjects who tried to find foothold in very complex imperial and national politics. And finally, he also filmed a parade in the colony. And I just wanted to read here. Here in the parade, which is different from the Lindbergh parade, the colonial hybridity can be seen plainly in the various costumes worn in the parade: lion dances, umbrella dances, local operas, and fan dances in Japanese kimono, and so on. And we can see that there was a boat. I didn't portray that. There's a boat, indicating the parade was for a celebration of the greater East Asia prosperity sphere, which is a Japanese imperialist concept. But what does it mean to dance in a colony and under such a title? And here I, in the longer paper, I talked about how this sequence also shows about what compromise means, what is a compromised, how does one live and celebrate one's culture within a colonial environment. And like a child, Liu stared at dancers' inexplicable movements and immersed himself in the rituals that have much longer histories than Taiwan's history as colony. Different from the news parade, Liu's unnamed carnival in colonial Taiwan was a mystery. It was certainly colonial, both compromised and compromising, yet also surpassing these labels and exceeding the logics of imperialism and capitalism. It called for empathetical understanding. So I don't want to collapse the differentiation between hard and soft cinema. There is no doubt that Liu's refusal to reflect on class contradictions was delusional and self-serving, and the hard film proponents rightly called him out for that. Liu was certainly not a revolutionary, but a survivor. Though ironically, he didn't survive his assassination in 1940. Yet if we see revolutions as processes of becoming and revolutionary as an ever-evolving concept, then could the apparent non-revolutionary Liu Na'ou be to some extent revolutionary too? the revolution certainly relied on left-wing filmmakers to expose underlying structures of exploitation and to mobilize their demolition. And as we can see, the left-wing filmmakers did a lot of subversion to the documentary, while Liu Na'ou basically used the documentary and adhered to film, movie, and to travelogue, though tried to hide it. Yet Liu Na'ou's pursuit for an empathetical approach to the world, instead of swiftly applying hard rules and ideologies onto a precarious world struggling to survive within and beyond imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism, can that also be considered as a way of caring? And I have no ready answers, and I really would like to hear what you think about these two different ways of hard and soft documentary in China's 1930s, amidst war and revolt. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Qian Laoshi, for this wonderful talk. And I also just shared the link to our next event and also the link to our YouTube channel where you can find the recording of previous talks. And now it is my honor to introduce our respondent, Professor Géraldine Fiss. And before that, to the audience, please post your questions via Q&A button. The more questions, the better, and there's no big or small questions. All questions are welcome. So let me introduce Professor Géraldine Fiss. Géraldine Fiss is an associate teaching professor in Inter-Asia and Transpacific Studies at the Department of Literature at the University of California, San Diego, where she teaches modern Chinese literature, film, intellectual history, and aesthetics. Her research focuses on Chinese literary and cinematic modernisms, Chinese-German literary and poetic encounters, Chinese women's literature and film, and Chinese eco-critical discourses. In her current work, she examines modern and contemporary Chinese poetry and cinema and the transcultural influences that inform these literary and visual modes. So welcome, Géraldine.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Qian, for a wonderful talk. And thank you also for sharing your forthcoming article with me. I'm really grateful to have had a chance to read your work. And I really believe I speak for all of us when I say that your research and your meticulous readings of actuality-based films and other media in the 1930s greatly expands our understanding of visual culture at this time in Chinese history, and especially the ways in which documentary exerted, in fact, a far stronger impact upon the development of Chinese cinematic history than was previously known. I would like to highlight here a few points that I take away from your study, which I find simultaneously immensely intriguing and stimulating. And I would also like to pose a few questions for you to consider, and also possibly delineate some areas of inquiry, which may be very interesting for further research and study. So first of all, your work is really situated at the intersection of the practice of actuality-based documentary filmmaking and these radical acts of revolutionary care in the 1930s. Indeed, you state at the beginning of your paper that the filmmakers who chronicled the Shanghai massacre on May 30th, 1925, gave, as you write, attention to bloodstains, bullets, and corpses, and to workers and students in collective formation on the streets. And also, this is you highlight that this kind of cinema, which these filmmakers created, restores traces of events, objects, and bodies against acts of erasure and obscuration. And this was a direct quote from your text. So the central question you ask in your paper, I feel, is a very important one, and it really animates your study. And that question is how to find one's foothold and orientation in this very turbulent period of political struggles, mobilization, and displacement. And your answer to this question, which you propose in this study, is, if I understand correctly, that fictionalizing documentary records of actual events may, in fact, help tell the stories and convey the authenticity of these lived events, which are often connected to great suffering, right? And also the problem of survival. In fact, you evoke Liang Qian, right? Who, as you say, realized that our immediate perceptual capacities no longer suffice, right? And that the immediate perception of the world beyond our immediate surroundings is necessary to grasp the complex reality of our existence in a world of imperial expansion, global capitalism, and changing technology. These are also your words. And then your core question in your paper is, what role can cinema play in such mediations? And how can different modes of actuality-based filmmaking turn these sensory and empirical unfoldings before the camera into experience and knowledge, as you write, to help with social analysis, political mobilization, and personal healing? So forgive me for quoting your text quite extensively here, but I really couldn't have said it better than you said it yourself in your paper. So what I find really interesting is that when you look at Cheng Bugao, and in particular his realist masterpiece Spring Silkworms, as well as his film Torrent, Guangliu, both from 1933, right? What I find interesting is that in your paper, you connect Cheng Bugao's work, which you posit as hard documentary, to Liu Na'ou's travelogues and amateur home videos. But you posit all of these works as a kind of docu-fiction, and you pay very close attention to how reality is conveyed and chronicled in each of these films, and how fictional storytelling elements are also woven in. So you really highlight, I think, beautifully in your study, right, that in a way, both Cheng Bugao and Liu Na'ou, they posit these filmed realities as, quote, sites of experience and knowledge, and also as, quote, reflections upon the epistemological limits, as well as revolutionary potentials, right, which are connected to the immediate struggle of survival. So in other words, the notions of survival and struggle really become key concerns, in fact, in both of their works, though of course in markedly different ways. So I find that extremely interesting, right, that you are connecting these two ostensibly very, very different films in this larger concern that you have with how can film be sites of experience and knowledge, how can it be a mode of reflection, and how does it combine both documentary elements and fictional elements. So I really commend you for, for combining such very different cinematic oeuvre in the same comparative lens. That I find extremely interesting, and it's really a key takeaway point for me. So I do have a question, actually, that I have a question regarding your analysis of Cheng Bugao's work. And in a way, I'd like to connect your concrete study of Cheng Bugao to your larger concern in your book, in your forthcoming book, Revolutionary Becomings, Documentary Media in 20th Century China. Because in your book, you state that you see documentary cinema as a prism to examine how media and revolutions are mutually constitutive of each other, right? And specifically, on the one hand, you examine how revolutionary movements gave rise to media practices, that, as you say, reconfigured political and social realities. And on the other hand, you also look at how media practices inform the actualization of revolutionary movements. So my question here is, since you did not actually address this directly in your article, how does this larger concern inform your study of Cheng Bugao's work? How does his unique mode of filmmaking, which, as you show, skillfully merges elements of documentary and fictional storytelling, become intertwined with revolutionary practice? If we consider that revolutionary activity at this time in Chinese history is in fact connected to a profound ethos of care for Chinese people, and if we also consider that this act of care is expressed through reflecting reality in an authentic way, so what role does this unique mode of docu-fiction play in activating the affective apparatus, right? The viewer's emotions to kind of engender what you call a revolutionary becoming. So in other words, to put my question in a different way, how does Cheng's mode of filmmaking and also the aesthetics of his film, which, as you show, kind of shortens the distance between the city and the countryside, allowing the viewer to understand the two spaces as connected, right? And in that way, showing the exploitative relationship that underlies the people's lives, and also the strong focus on the lives of the springworms, right? And on the evolution and on the daily minutiae and recordings of the springworms' lives. How does this particular and unique aesthetics of Cheng's films overall, and particularly spring silkworms, enhance the revolutionary impact upon the viewers to actually care and act, right? So to put my question in yet another way, how does this hybrid of fiction and documentary, in a way, this interplay of what you call authentic newsreel, right? And a more authorial mediation by the filmmaker, how does all of that enhance the effective power of the film and then result in radical acts of care, which are part of revolutionary movements at that time? So that's one of my first questions. I'm also very, very interested in the way in which you juxtapose the Lindbergh parade, which you posit really as a spectacle, right, as a pageant, with the Shanghai air raid, and that this in turn really this concern with suffering and war and destruction, right? It leads to a different conception of camera truth, especially in Chinese documentary filmmakers of this wartime period. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about this notion of incommensurability that you mentioned, right? That in fact, you say that the American newsreel format, right? Even though it is suitable for many forms of, reflection of reality, in fact, Chinese filmmakers are kind of reacting against that, right? They are against the kind of spectacle, right, that is occurring in the American newsreel. And in fact, they are creating a kind of different documentary filmmaking or even docu-fiction film, which places at the heart of it an ethics of representation and really is concerned with ethics, authenticity, and the problem of spectacle, right? And what they do not want to do is create the same kind of spectacle that American newsreel films create, or at least that's the perception, I believe, of Chinese filmmakers. And so instead, if I understand correctly, you advocate in your paper that fictionalization or integrating elements of fictionalization can in fact serve as a solution to this problem of spectacle and create an ethics and an empathy right? So in other words, it's a way by means of integrating certain fictional elements, you can enhance the truth of documentary filmmaking and more fully and completely show in a more authentic and in a more ethical and in a more empathetic way the actual suffering and destruction that occurred at this time. So you describe these films with a plot, right? Which you see as a very powerful element of these films that were made at this time, and which are really concerned with reflecting reality in a very authentic way. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, about this this interesting notion that integrating elements of fictionality can in fact increase ethics and authenticity and solve the problem of spectacle. My third question is about Liu Na'ou, who I have read extensively, primarily as a member of the Xinganjuepai group in Shanghai, and together with Shi Zhicun and Mu Shiying and other writers. He was really kind of a dandy, as you say, and a flaneur who moves throughout the city, and he's in a very Benjaminian way, kind of chronicling the sensations of the city upon his own subjectivity. And they're all doing that at this moment, at this modernist moment in Shanghai. But I have not really at all, I wasn't even aware that Liu Na'ou also made films. And in fact, I think that's kind of a something that is missing from our studies of Chinese Shanghai modernism at this time, right? I mean, we study all kinds of films that were made at this very interesting moment in Shanghai, such as, you know, for example, Song at Midnight, Yeban Gesheng, and other kinds of films that were influenced by, modernist fictional, modernist cinematic modes that were coming in, German expressionism and other things. And you focus, of course, especially on documentary. But my question is actually, you posit Liu as a survivor, and you also foreground his intersubjective approach in his soft kind of filmmaking. And in that way, you also highlight liquidity and water, because he himself has this very transnational subjectivity, which is very problematic at this time as he moves between Taiwan, China, and Japan, which eventually gets him killed, of course. So what I'm wondering, first of all, is how is Liu Na'ou's form of filmmaking connected to his modernist fictional literary practice, particularly the Xinganjuepai fiction that he was creating? Do the films that he created, do they, even though they are, as you say, amateur films and kind of home videos almost, do they express his complicated transnational subjectivity as an urban flaneur, which at this time is very fraught and very dangerous, right? And in fact, costs him his life. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more how his actual very interesting subjectivity comes to the foreground in these films. I'm also wondering whether he's using any kind of experimental or aesthetic filmmaking techniques in his soft documentary modes here, because in a way, he's also reflecting suffering, right? Just as Cheng Bugao is. The difference is that Cheng Bugao has a more external focus. He's concerned with, war, the fallout from war, the suffering of the community, right? And how it is connected to revolution, whereas Liu Na'ou is more concerned with internal reality, right? But what kind of links Cheng Bugao and Liu Na'ou together, as your study shows, is that both are really approaching filmmaking in a very collaborative, relational way, right? And you mentioned that at the beginning of your talk, right? That documentary film as a media is very relational and collaborative. So in a way, intersubjectivity, as well as suffering and notions of survival, connect both of these modes of filmmaking, the hard documentary filmmaking of Cheng Bugao and the soft documentary filmmaking of Liu Na'ou. So I was wondering, how is suffering and survival a theme in both of their documentary filmmaking modes? And do you see in Liu Na'ou's documentary or docu-fictional filmmaking maybe some aesthetic experimentation in the visual mode? Because he was such a creative modernist writer, and he was never afraid to push the boundaries and experiment in terms of modernist style and language. And he has a deeply subjective focus in his fiction. So I wonder whether you kind of can see a link between Liu Na'ou's literary fiction, his modernist writings, and his fiction and his documentary films. Yeah, and then my last question actually is, in your article, you do mention Jigo Vertov's Kino Eye, and of course that is an important concern, right? Because that, I think, these Chinese documentary filmmakers, they would have been very aware of Russian documentary filmmakers at this time, but you don't say very much about other kinds of cinema that were coming into this very cosmopolitan space of 1930s Shanghai, and how these filmmakers that you're looking at, how they may have been aware of it. I'm thinking of French cinema verité, for example, and then also other non-documentary modes, right? We know that this period in 1930 Shanghai was a very rich meeting of different cultures. Liu Li showed that in his book, Shanghai Modern. And I'm wondering whether these filmmakers, in terms of their aesthetic approach to docu-fictional filmmaking, whether they were also aware of, or whether they're making references to or using certain techniques of other modes of visual storytelling that were certainly very widely available and shown in Shanghai at that time. I'm sorry, I think I may have gone a little bit over time. I'm sorry. But these were my thoughts about your wonderful paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow, I'm really there's so many questions, like so much. It's amazing. Thank you so much. And I think you also helped me to, especially what you said about survival, suffering, and care. And sort of thinking about revolution in these ways. And this is really to think about revolution in a very situated way, I think. Because we tend to, when we think about revolutions, the book. So I mean, if I want to just sort of comment a bit about sort of documentary and becoming and reading documentary, but having revolution in mind, for this book, I think it's really my purpose of thinking about revolution as becomings is really to first to say that, well, revolutionary processes are deeply historical. They're embedded in sort of all these historical formations, and everything and in these periods, I mean, already in the 20s and in the 30s, you already see that nothing is fixed. Everything is moving, and even after 1949, when the socialist transformation happened, I mean, because the book kind of covers from the beginning of 20th century to the end of 1980s, during this whole entire time, no concept or practice or anything stayed the same. So I think one challenge I had through the book, so that this may not apply to this chapter, but to some extent it did apply to this chapter, in the sense that the challenge I had through this book was to think about a methodology that can allow me to write through change and write through interdependent change. And I think I think, you know, a lot of this, when I sort of talk about be like water, like in relation to Liu Na'ou, and also, you know, his attunement and his sort of fascination, like even when in his film there was, you know, steps, like going down steps, going upstairs, even just his fascination with these kind of steps. And if you think about it, it's stepping down the staircases is really to lose your center of weight. It's about losing your center of weight and getting it back. And I feel that through this, you know, this whole 20th century, there was just so much moments like this. And I want to say that, you know, in the end, revolution is an extremely experimental process. And this is a process that will be inherently full of failure, because experiments mean that there will be failure. And I think also that's why care is so important for the revolutionary process, or for any process that envisions a better world and fight for it and experiment with the process of getting there. Because you know, like any movement that we see now today in our midst, you know, that actually, I mean, when we think about it, it's deeply experimental. And there's so much, and people will be hurt. You know, of course, I think, you know, the prior revolutions, I mean, one of the big critique I had over these prior revolutions was, you know, that lack of attunement, you know, that lack of attunement to changing realities and being imprisoned in, you know, in fixed ideas, right? I mean, you know, I draw from social historians when I talk about kind of the reification of class labels, for example, when the socialist transformation had already happened, and, you know, it's an achievement that had already been well underway, but continuing to hold on to the sort of deep, you know, seated worries of subversion and of enemies and all of this. So I think in this book, I'm trying to kind of use documentary as a way to think about how we see unfoldings in our midst and how we be attuned to it. But at the same time, also, so I think Liu Na'ou and Cheng Bugao, they come together in this way. I mean, I have no interest to, like, you know, say, oh, Liu Na'ou is in the revolutionary ranks. I mean, I think he is, you know, he is a deeply problematic, he was in a deeply problematic position. And I think he, you know, so I don't mean to say like he is revolutionary, but what I want to say is that he, because of his position, he actually wasn't able to really be, you know, be in any fixed category. And so he had to negotiate these changing categories and even hiding, and, you know, he does all of this. So to some extent, he is a bit different from the revolutionaries who are Chinese nationals, you know, intellectuals, and very much, you know, sort of seated in a safer place. And I think his experience in that way as a marginal person and his sort of survival tactics, you know, to some extent can help us understand, you know, I mean, so I believe that, you know, regardless of people's sort of political orientations and all of this, like some of their most genuine experiences, I mean, oppressors, even, you know, when we think about liberation, it's the liberation of the oppressed, but also secondarily, you know, the liberation of the oppressed also liberates the oppressor. So in the end, you know, like when we think about situated knowledge, we think about, you know, all kinds of knowledge that can help us reflect on, you know, on this amazing experiment that's revolutionary transformation. So I think it's in this way that I kind of start, because the thing is that, you know, Liu Na'ou is one of the rare cases where actually you see this very personal and kind of, you know, he's very interesting, because the rest of, I mean, because there's not a lot of amateur film during that time, and so also, you know, I think Géraldine, you asked about his experiments. I mean, again, his experiments for me is so interesting in the film because it was not professional at all. You know, like I think he could hide from his literary production, like he could kind of play, and we kind of don't know where he is, you know, because he's all over the place. But if you look at what he started to do from scratch, you see it very clearly what he is experimenting, you know, and you see this whole film reels as kind of notebooks, almost notebooks of like homeworks almost, you know, and it's so to some extent, it's kind of, it's really interesting for me to think then about how we learn, you know, how we learn in a situated way, you know, and for him, how he learns, and then for revolutionary, how they learn. I mean, for example, Cheng Bugao was learning too, you know, Cheng Bugao in 1925, I mean, he was celebrating the American newsreel. You know, by the time of the bombing, he started to see, oh, wait a second, you know, the newsreel, you know, portrays China and Japan equally. It's as if like it's, and then, I mean, I didn't show you the Pata, the British Pata production basically just says, oh, is war worth it? You know, these Orientals, they're just kind of fighting their war. Like it's so irrational. You know, it like we've already gone past it. I guess that's kind of the First World War, but of course there's some Second World War coming. But you know, so Cheng Bugao then realized that, you know, he couldn't do the same actually, and there's something wrong with it. And I think by that time, you know, Xia Yan and a lot of these you know, revolutionaries and radicals in China, they realized that in order to be revolutionary, you need to really deeply think about the media at hand, you know, and it's not that they I mean, I feel like it's not that they abandoned documentary, like the, I mean, you know, 1925 already, like they got into the morgues and into the hospitals. And through history, you see that people come together to protect the filmmakers, to form networks. And even before then, like, you know, in 1911 revolution, you already have these networks being built around film production. And so the struggle for visibility was always there. And so it didn't, like Chinese filmmakers didn't entirely go into docu-fiction. I mean, during the civil war, during the war, you know, of the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party fighting over the control of the country, in you know, leading to 1949, the communist liberation success. This war was fought, you know, I mean, filmmakers died on the battlefronts. You know, they filmed soldiers before they went into the battle, and then buried the soldiers at night after the battle. I mean, I mean, documentary did a lot of such work, being with people, filming them, and even, you know, Great Leap Forward documentaries. Now, when you look at it, you see that, wow, you know, filmmakers were there with them, you know, and filming all this exhaustion and this hard striving that they were going through. And so I think there is this just very fundamental level of care of just being there with them, you know, in making film a comfort, like, you know, for the soldiers to go on into the battle. I mean, this also happened in the Korean War when a soldier went into the battle, you know, they were filmed or photographed beforehand, right? So, but at the same time, I think they're also not afraid of experimenting. They were not afraid of experimenting, you know, in this docu-fiction, because they very quickly realized documentary realism wasn't right for them, and it requires so much capital. It's capital intensive, while Gerson would not recognize that, you know, and I think, like in sort of affluent and, you know, full of access societies, they realized it a bit later. I mean, documentary realism, of course, was critiqued heavily in the 60s and 70s, especially 70s. But I think so. I think Cheng Bugao and all the others, they used docu-fiction in order not only, I mean, on one hand, to provide emotional tenor and to provide this affect, but I think there's also a very, like, analytical, you know, they wanted to show that vision is problematic, you know, that it's not only like, I mean, Liang Qichao was saying like, oh, we need media to see beyond our, immediate surroundings. And that's like the end of 19th century. He's like, oh, we need media. But they are, Cheng Bugao, they're saying, well, media is very problematic. It's positioned, and who makes the film matters, for what purpose matters. And so I think the radical care he and the left-wing filmmakers were giving was exactly to be with the farmer when they went bankrupt, and then to say, well, you didn't know better. Of course you didn't know better, because and being with them and noticing how they labored, right? And also this process of labor, which was disappearing because it was a very traditional process that involved the whole community, which is itself a process of care, process of caring for the silkworms and process of caring family and so on. But that will soon disappear. Later on you see the silk cocoons going into these factories and hiring all these women, oppressed workers. And so I think that so basically I think he is there with these, I mean, this wasn't a documentary, so this was an acted film, but he wanted to convey the idea to all the people who didn't know why things happen that way, that we are there with you, and there is a problem, and we recognize that problem with you. And I think that's the radical care that the left-wing filmmakers were giving. And I think so and this care, I think, continued on, and in different periods, this care was very intensified. I mean, in the end of the end of the Cultural Revolution in the early 1980s was also this a lot of kind of being there with you. I know how much you confused, but we're being there with you, kind of care. And then so I think for Liu Na'ou, I mean, again, this Liu Na'ou piece, I really am not sure about. Like, I feel that when I write it, I feel a little bit of trouble, sort of worry, because I don't know how it works. But I feel that, I mean, amateur film was very little studied, and there so I wanted to kind of experiment with it to see how it might fit also into this larger but I think what Géraldine, what you said about suffering and about survival, and about how in revolutionary processes we need to really acknowledge these things. I mean, I feel that the Chinese 20th century is full of trauma. And so at every stage, people are not only dealing with what's happening at that stage, like all these, geopolitical things happening, all this, miscomprehensions or misrecognitions of what was going on, and then debating about these, but also, what was traumatic for them coming to this point. And so I think that to think of, and of course now we also see wars happening all around the world. And I think I think at the present moment, the like Black Lives Matter, or in other moments, like I think people are now more and more aware of care and the importance of care in revolutionary movements, which is really wonderful, I think. So yeah, okay, wait, I think I'll stop. Yeah.
All right, thank you both for this wonderful sort of response and also response. So I do have a list of questions waiting to be answered. So first question is from Shiqi Lin. Thank you, I'm quoting her words. Thank you for such a rich talk, Professor Qian. I'm very interested in the way in which the concept of infrastructure plays in this study beyond being a network of film production and distribution. Could you talk more about how thinking of documentary through infrastructure ties to the mediation of care and relationship? Methodologically, when we dive into close reading of a film, how do we connect an infrastructural analysis with a reading of aesthetics and cinematography?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think, I mean, there has in contemporary documentary, we are now talking about documentary as almost like as space and as infrastructure, like especially online documentary, for people to come together and to have infrastructure for people to put their videos online and then for people to share it. And so it becomes a design, and when we think about infrastructure is you make something happen through some kind of engineering, some kind of systematic, arrangement for something to happen. And I think documentary for a long period of time from the beginning, beginning of documentary, beginning of cinema, actually relied very heavily on networks and on existing infrastructures of moving things around. So, I mean, the American newsreel definitely, relied on infrastructures of transportation, of processing of films, there's a whole set of sort of material infrastructure for being able to be eyewitnesses to remote events like this. It's already achieved in the mid 20th century. when we think about it, now we have, of course, streaming. But when we also think about, these activist networks, these are not infrastructure. I feel like infrastructure and networks are a bit different, and infrastructure is more kind of consolidated. So it's kind of hardware, and it's kind of lays the ground, and it's not very easy to change. But while networks are much more, if people come together to form a nexus over something, and then network may continue, or maybe it kind of dissembles, so it kind of you might need to have more to connect them. So I feel like documentary production and documentary exhibition, because it's so much connected to it's not in the studio, right? It's not sort of confined. It's really in the world. So it's very good at creating these temporary liaisons that then might be productive in its own way. So I would say that, during the wartime, of course, Wei Hongbao also has written about propaganda films and thinking about propaganda as infrastructure, infrastructure for war. But I think it's both infrastructure and network, and it has both kind of a fixity, which I also talk a lot about in the Mao era documentaries, but it also has contingency. I think the contingency part is really, or not only contingency, but kind of this kind of attunement to what's new, and to kind of suddenly bring together something that's new. That I think is really like a core value of documentary. But at the same time, how to sustain that, and how to sustain that, but change with it, go with it. I think documentary serves a lot of these functions successfully or very unsuccessfurly.
All right, thank you. Second question is from Jieming Zhu, and I'm quoting this Jieming. Hi, Professor Qian, this is Jieming. Thank you for this much needed intervention in the question of care within Chinese revolutionary culture. I think you're making the point that historically revolutionary culture often undervalued care and easily dismissed it as being too quote unquote soft or quote unquote feminine. And that's why you're trying to rescue the revolutionary potentials of Liu Na'ou's soft filmmaking. My question, do you see elements of comradely care and or community care? Community here refers to a political community different from the rural communal life in spring silkworm in documentary practices during this period, or more broadly in Chinese revolution?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, Jimmy, I think you're really right. Because I was working on documentary, and this period, I was trying to unearth, sort of documentaries' impact on the hard and soft cinema. And with Liu Na'ou, it's also tried to use his documentary practice, then kind of reframe the soft cinema series, which I think a lot of scholars have already started to do, like Wei Hongbao and Zhang Zhen and Victor Fan. They've also tried to think about it not just as Hollywood and bourgeois and simply just Hollywood as bourgeois. I think that there is also a situatedness to soft film series. But because I was sort of searching for documentaries to analyze for this this chapter, so I didn't do much on on the other films. But in the left-wing films, actually, so left-wing films are not hard really. So I think it's a wrong, I think it's unfair criticism of left-wing films. If you look at all of them, I think there's a lot of comradeship. I love Big Road, for example, and Big Road has this queer moment of two women, but also there is this I love all of them moment, right? When Mo Li says, I love all of them, and there is this very horizontal, very free sort of connections between people, and also actually in Maoist films, like if we actually look at Maoist films carefully, and especially the 50s, when especially like and in my book I also talked about kind of mid-50s when filmmakers wanted to do something new. They feel like, well, the revolution has been achieved. Now we're we can. It's kind of like the Soviet Union in the first 10 years. They're like, oh, now we can do something crazy. And I think just free. And so but. In these moments, and also in other moments of Maoist film, and actually throughout, you can pick out so much of care, so much of care. I think, and yeah. So I think I agree with you, and that needs to be looked at more.
Okay, thank you. And the next question is from Timmy Chen. I'm quoting Timmy now. Thank you so much for your fascinating and inspiring talk. I really appreciate how you problematize the relationships between documentary and fiction, hard and soft films. My question is concerned with the concept of 博爱, or universal love, employed by both the Chinese and Japanese sides for mobilization and propaganda purposes. Can you say more about this concept in relation to your idea of revolutionary care and becoming?
That's such a good intervention. Thank you, Jimmy. I think so with Liu, I think for Cheng Bugao, I think the sympathy for, or the sympathy for the victim, and also neutrality in such a war is a really bad thing. And I think so I think for Cheng Bugao, it's very clear, like Cheng Bugao and later Xia Yan, and how they they are for them it's not so much of love, and it's more about sort of being, stand with the victims, I think. But I think for Liu Na'ou, I do find, and that's also a bit, like I feel like my analysis of it may be overlooking some of his political positioning. But I think, so in my analysis, I very carefully talked about what opportunities were open to him and what were limited to him. Actually, he wasn't able to stay in Taiwan. He had to go to Japan because in Taiwan, it was much harder to get into university. So he was, the fact that he was going to Japan was not because, he was a free-flowing, sort of Japanese subject that could go anywhere, but rather it was an exile from his home. And then, of course, I can't, this is my reading of him, but I understand his precarity, and because of that, I see that his connections with others as a mode of protection, as a sort of pursuit of protection, a pursuit of foothold, and also seeing the family as a sort of this community of protection. I do think that, you know, like I should probably look more into, like, there's not enough research. I think if there were research, I would like to look into the social history of his family lineage, like to understand, you know, the extent of collaboration. And I think there is something that's collaboration, and you know, we can't just say colonial subjects and they're all just surviving. I think, you know, some people really got a lot of you know, mileage and privilege out of that position, out of being that, you know, that kind of elite, you know, colonial subject position. So I think my assessment was not on Liu Na'ou as a person, but more on what this film in particular could allow us to kind of start to see soft cinema in a different way, and see filmmaking in a different way. I think universal love it should happen when there is no oppression. I think, I think when there is oppression, you know, there is no universal love. So yeah, so I think that but in order to get there, I think understanding people's situatedness, and also once a person, like for example, once someone who is an oppressor, when he ceases to be an oppressor, then it's a different question. Then he needs to be given care. And I think actually there is a whole discourse on care and justice, and on, you know, like on how do you care for people who in an unjust situation. And I think that's a really interesting question that I want to look more into.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Chen Feng Wang, and I'm quoting Chen Feng. Hello, Professor Qian, thank you for your talk. I have a question about the concept docu-fiction. If fictional elements can be involved in documentary making, how should we reconsider the boundary or definition of documentary, especially when characters in a film are no longer real people presenting themselves in reality, but actors and actresses playing certain roles? In what ways can we still consider this film related to documentary practice? Moreover, when we speak of quote unquote reality, are we referring to the psychological, perceptual, emotional reality, as well as the physical reality? Would it make the practice of documentary over too all-inclusive if we can include all these things into this concept?
Wow, that's also a really wonderful question. So reconsider the boundary of definition of documentary. So documentary has always been said to be very difficult to define. So, you know, like classical scholars of, you know, who have provided really like the long-lasting classical documentary theory, Bill Nichols, for example, he admits, you know, documentary uses all fictional sort of, all fictional strategies. So in this book, I basically take a position that there is no universal documentary. Documentary should not be defined. I take a position of not ontology, but ontogenesis, to say that documentary is the historical formation of its possibilities. That's what I in the end end up with. So I don't take every fiction to be documentary. I think in Cheng Bugao's case, it's through a very grounded, historically grounded research to see that, you know, he actually developed from a nonfiction filmmaker. I mean, his first two films are nonfiction, and also with warlords and so on. But then, you know, and I'm reading his fictional films because of these experiences that I could see in his personal development history. And so I think that, you know, in that case, so I think when we look at documentary and fiction, and when we think about, like whether something can be involved in a documentary and discussed in relation to documentary, I feel like this historically grounded work is very important. And then also reality. It's actually it's a very hard word, and in documentary we always have documentary representing reality, right? That the question for a long time for documentary studies has been, does this represent reality? But I mean, what if reality is changing, and what if documentary is actually a productive process that gathers people for it and then works with these people and transforms the situation? Then where is the reality in this? Documentary is part of that changing reality, so I actually also argued in the big longer book that I'm not looking at documentary as representation. I'm looking at the process of representation, which I theorize as mediation, which is basically, and so that's why it's documentary media, which basically says that it is really coming into thing, coming. And again, media is also becoming. So something becomes a media by coming into things to solve some problem, right? And so documentary was also that kind of media, and any kind of other thing can be that kind of media. And so I feel like in the end, it's really about, we are also in this sort of disciplinarily, totally, it's kind of a mix up, and then that we a lot of the categories that we, especially new media, a lot of categories that we consider to be categories are no longer categories. And so I think now it requires a lot of kind of sort of historical and kind of tracing work to carve out the subject of our study. So I think maybe that's the answer for,
Okay, thank you so much. And our last question is from Michael Piantini, and I'm quoting Michael right now. This was a deeply fascinating body of work, and I inspired to search for more of these types of histories. Speaking for myself as a young academic, how did you conceptualize this project to connect questions of aesthetic documentary sensibilities and the histories of early 20th century Chinese documentary? What type of conclusions do you envision readers to walk away with?
Questions of aesthetic documentary sensibilities, maybe, in the history of. That's an interesting question. I'm not sure what kind of conclusion I want you to walk away with, because I think it should be more open. I think that I start to realize now that for me, at least, academic writing should be telling complex stories. Like the stories are so complex that I can't handle it, and I think that's a good story when it comes. But of course, it makes writing very difficult. It makes things very difficult to trace. But a complex story then offers just a lot of space, and when we think about open space, to think and to discuss. And in the end, I feel like maybe that's what we should do. Instead of drawing conclusions or giving conclusions, it is to raise that question. And I think again, if there is any, actually, I wanted to say if there's any conclusion, but actually I don't want to. So I think I'll leave it like that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. We unfortunately we're running out of time. Again, thank you, Qian Laoshi and Géraldine, so much for your wonderful talk and response. And also, I'm sharing again to everyone the registration link to Professor Bishnu Ghosh's talk on Thursday, May the 18th via Zoom. And also, please subscribe to the YouTube channel of UCSD Arts and Humanities to watch the recording of earlier talks. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. And thank you, Géraldine. Thank you. Yeah.